So, the first underway I went on, I got put on the night shift, and I was paired up with a second-class petty officer who was training me. We ended up having some issues with some of our communications gear. Luckily, we were able to trace the issue to an equipment rack that we had in the supply chief's office. When we looked at it, we found out that the cannon plug from the ship's power to the equipment was so old that the insulation from the pins had broken down and was letting power arc between the pins. So we returned to our shop to find a new plug to replace it, but unfortunately we didn't have any of the right plugs. However, we did end up finding the right size insulation and pins, so we came up with the idea that we could just rebuild the plug with the insulation and resolder all the new pins on the existing wire. Now, with it being in the middle of the night, we couldn't run the proper safety chits for the work that we had to do, so the guy training me would just stand by the breaker box right outside the room that held our gear to make sure that no one came by and turned it on while I was working. After I finished soldering the new pins, my next step was to turn the power back on so I could check with the multimeter to see which pins had power. That way, I could install them back into the plug correctly. So I slid the metal housing for the plug back, and I told the second class to go ahead and flip the breaker back on. When I went to go measure the pins, it made the plug housing slide back down and hit the multimeter leads on the pins. I dropped everything in time to not get shocked, but there was a flash and I could hear a breaker trip. The other guy came running in to make sure that I was okay, and found me sitting there frozen. I told him what happened, and we went and got new pins and new multimeter leads, because the old pins had melted and I think one of them actually welded itself to the multimeter lead. So after we resoldered everything and made sure it was on there correctly, we went to go and turn the breaker back on, and then nothing happened. So after doing a little bit of investigative work, we figured out that when I blew the breaker, I actually blew 2 breakers and not 1. This was a little bit of a problem because the second breaker had a bunch of non-critical gear on the ship that had no power to it now, making our sneaky night ops not so sneaky. So apparently, people have been calling to our shop while we were down doing all this work, complaining about things not working. So we ended up tracing out the power drawings and found where the breakers were that needed to be flipped back on. However, it was in someone else's locked space. Of course. It always is like that. Eventually, we were able to find someone to get access into that room and flip the breakers back on and got everything working again. Luckily, this was before anybody with any real importance started to ask any questions about why the power had dropped. So long story short, if you're gonna do some sneaky night ops, make sure you know what you're doing. When diving in deep water, or in water with limited visibility, you get to a point similar to this. So I was doing a deep dive, about 130 feet in the water, that had about 40 to 50 foot visibility. So around 50 feet deep, we reached this point of total blueness. You couldn't see the surface, you couldn't see the floor, all you could see is just blue everywhere. Light blue above you, dark blue below. Blue as far as you could see in all directions. It messed with your depth perception. You'd think the guy next to you would be about 6 feet away, but then you would reach out to them and they're really 20 plus feet away. I think this is the closest I'll ever be to being in space. I just felt so weightless in this infinite blue nothingness. That being said, we all were grouped together and each person was assigned a specific partner. So everyone, about 6 of us, would all stay together, and no pair would be lost from each other. This would ensure that no single person could fall away from the group. When diving, this is a very serious matter. You always stay with your partner. I've never felt scared of being in the water versus being on land. It felt so natural to me, really. I've been chased by elk, I had to stare down a black bear on land before. But in the water, I've never been threatened directly by an animal. However, there was this one time when I had a pretty big oh shit moment while I was diving. Now, to set the scene, we were diving a large wreck. I think it was an old tanker ship or something. We were on the landward side of it, and everything was great. This is about 100 to 110 feet deep, so we only had 5 minutes of air. So how this works is, the deeper you dive, the quicker you burn through your air supply due to compression. So, we are below the deck of the ship, off facing to the side where the land is. There's no real current, and everything is just peachy keen. We cross around the bow of the ship. That was so cool looking. And start trying to swim back towards the backside, except now we're on the seaward side. I notice I'm not getting any distance on the ship, so I'm swimming harder. And now I'm starting to actually lose distance on the ship. We've just been caught in a strong current. So my reaction is just to gas into the current. However, this is not a smart move. We're still losing ground. I'm being pulled backwards, out and away from the dive and land. At this point, panic sets in. But it's cool. I gotta stay calm. I gotta keep my breathing under control. So I signal to my buddy, and I motion to him that I want to dive perpendicular. Basically, back towards land. Try to cut back out of this current. We do this, but it's exhausting, and we now are gulping down air. So we go up a little, and then take a break. We check our air supply, and decide it's time to return to the surface. I was never in any real danger. We knew what to do, but knowing how to react and actually finding yourself being swept away are two different things. When we reach the surface, all the experienced divers come over to tell me that I should have expected the current with how the ship was laying parallel to the land, etc. Oh well, lessons learned. So we were anchored out in France, and I was on the sponson, smoking. I watched a little red light creep under the water next to the ship for a good 10 minutes. It was smooth and slow moving. It scared me, but I kept thinking, I'm on a Navy ship, so I can see all these lights, it's not a big deal. But the absolute feeling of aloneness. Not loneliness, that's different. But you're all alone in the middle of the night. There's no moon, there's no stars, just darkness, the hum of the ship, and the sounds of your own breathing. If you stare off into the darkness for too long, you kind of feel like it's pulling you in. It's almost hypnotic. It sounds cheesy, but it's fucking true. I always kept my back to the wall just to keep myself grounded. So there's this time on the sea called T-Pod. Total period of darkness. It's nothing much, but there's no moon during this time. Moreover, there's absolutely no source of light on the open sea, so T-Pod can get a little weird. You would see absolutely nothing. It's just your ship sailing into nothingness while the waves splatter your bows. So pirates in the Indian Ocean is a real thing. Now, when you see a vessel on the edge of the horizon, there's no telling how long it will take for you two to come across. But the small pirate boat took, I think, a minute or two to cross our bows. They were armed with a couple of AK-47s and had their faces covered. And yes, they had a very fast boat. Luckily, we didn't have any run-ins with them. So now, being a Navy vet, I've never actually heard of the T-Pod, but I've actually experienced this phenomenon myself when I was on deployment in 2017. But, so the story goes on my end, so we're doing some maintenance on one of our radar antennas, and we have jets parked at the aft of the ship, which is the back. And so I'm walking over there with my friend Penny, and she has the flashlight, and the flashlight has a red lens, so I can't see it, really. And she's way ahead of me, and I tell her to slow down, but at that point it's too late. So I walk face first into a jet. Yes, a big ass fucking jet. Just straight head first. And I have this bruise on my cheek for the next few days, and she's like, how could you even do that? And I'm like, I can't see shit out here. What am I supposed to do? But yeah, I mean, and there is something weird about not being able to see anything that's around you. Nothing. You can't see your hand in front of your face. And then there's times out there where it's the exact opposite, and the moon is actually reflecting so much sunlight that it looks like a dimmer sun, and everything is lit up. And you can see all the stars, you can see everything, and it's incredible. It's kind of eerie too, because it's oh, this This is what the sun would look like if it was dying, kind of deal. And I've also experienced pirates, but that was in the Persian Gulf, whatever, you know. Because, like, what are these damn little pirate ships gonna do to an aircraft carrier? We have a Sea Whiz, like, you can't do shit to us. So my most unsettling experience was during a man overboard drill we were conducting one evening. We dropped Oscar over the side of our boat with his PFD and emergency light. Then, we turned the ship around, but the sun was all gone. I tried to keep an eye out for the PFD light the entire time as Oscar drifted between the waves. It put it in perspective how important it is to keep an eye on someone who's fallen overboard. Even a blink and you could lose where he is. How small you are compared to this vast ocean is nothing to joke about. Another time is probably when the ship goes completely silent from power failure. There's no vibrations, no sound of air coming through the air ducts, and there's no lights except for battle lanterns. This only happens when there's a loss of main power and the start of emergency power. I remember this one time, I had a real freak out one morning after I got off night watch. Right after I fell asleep, the Navy side decided to do a little live fire exercise right above my stateroom. I tell you what, that's better than a cup of coffee to wake up to in the morning. The other stories and the other experiences have already been said. The teapot experience, obviously that's nothing but blackness, abundant stars in the sky, but not enough to see in the horizon. If you're lucky, the only sound you'll hear is the vibration of the ship. The rest of the noise you hear is from your mind trying to comprehend the silence and darkness. Now, as I go through these stories in my head, probably the creepiest thing that has ever happened to me was being told of a shipmate who absolutely lost it. He started stabbing dirty laundry bags, saying that the ghosts were out to get him. When his roommate got the knife from him, he reached into his rack and grabbed another, and then another, and then another. In all, this guy had 20 knives and a pair of safety scissors. At least he didn't go on a stabbing spree. That would have been a real shit show. Other unsettling things is when we got a report of a lifeboat that was loose from our ship in a bad storm. We were tasked with finding it to put a marker on it. However, we didn't have the means to recover it. But seeing a half-sunken lifeboat adrift in the open waters gives me some real chills. To leave off with a funny story. One time, there was this drunk guy on board who took a shit in a bucket and left it in our paint locker. Needless to say, Chief was not amused. On the tall ship for the military, we had a guy fall from the rig and land in the water. It was in the middle of a storm in the Caribbean. When we brought him back up to the ship, we saw that he'd broken his leg and his hip. So he had to tread water for about 12 minutes without the use of his legs, and 5 to 6 foot swells. We made an emergency stop at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, to drop him off so he can get treatment. He ended up being flown back to the States, and he's recovering pretty well. So, this story's from my dad, and he spent 14 years in the Navy, serving aboard a nuclear fast attack submarine. The story is more unsettling than it is creepy, but he and his boat were deployed into the North Sea, and about a week into their voyage, one of their senior enlisted crew members died of a heart attack. Well, you know, submarines have very tight operational security, which means that they can go underwater and they won't come back up unless it's an emergency or they reach a US naval base. So, this guy died only a week into their operation, and they had no choice but to put him in the freezer. So, there was this dead crew member in their freezer for nearly 2 months. Oh, and because they had to clear out that room, just to fit him in, everyone on board was ordered to eat a triple serving of ice cream or it would go bad. Now, after reading the story, I can tell you this. You know, being on a Navy ship, you never want ice cream. Ever. You know that means you're gonna stay out to sea longer or there's some bad shit that's gonna happen. But I would never want to eat ice cream because somebody died and we can't get rid of his body. That would be so shitty. Not only for his family, but for the crew who has to eat food that's from that freezer where the dead dude is. I mean, that doesn't seem sanitary to me at all. But, you know, whatever, it's the Navy, right? You're just a bunch of cattle. They gotta feed you somehow. So, returning from deployment during Desert Storm, we were in the middle of the Atlantic, like seriously, middle of nowhere, deep ocean. Suddenly, we get a contact on the radar. As we get closer, it's a seriously small, like 40-foot or so, sailboat with an old guy standing up, waving his arms and hailing us. As we drew closer, we realize it's a little old man on this boat in the middle of nowhere, only with his dog. We thought for sure that he needed assistance, but nope. He just wanted to know if we had any cigarettes that we can give him. What we ended up doing is giving him some fresh water, extra food, and a couple of ship's hats and t-shirts, and then he went about his business. So imagine this. You're thousands of miles away from anything, and you get approached by some dude who needs smokes. The worst thing I've ever experienced was a rogue wave. I was on a submarine, and we were ported in Portsmouth, England, when the word got out that we had to pull out early in order to get ahead of a particularly nasty storm. Well, any Atlantic sailor can tell you that the English Channel is a rough body of water. Maybe not as bad as the Cape, but easily just as bad as the Baronet Sea. Anyways, the storm caught us right in the middle of offloading, chucking overboard some eggs that have gotten salmonella. Real quick, I needed to state that although I've been in the Navy for 4 years, this was my first sea command, and I've been on board for a grand total of 2 weeks. Again, we were deep sixing. That's Navy language for chucking shit into the deep sea that you're not supposed to. So, we ended up throwing over the side hundreds of these eggs, and lucky me, I was lucky enough to be topside helping. So to set the scene, I was in the hatch, and I didn't have a harness on because I was technically still inside the ship. And there was a guy above me doing the chucking of the eggs. So, it started as a black cloud rolling over us. Then a light sprinkle. 2 minutes later, it was sheets of torrential rain and wind, waves all over. I was soaked to the bone, and the sail of the submarine, the tail bit of the top, is at least 10 meters out of the water, and it's still catching spray from these waves. Then, all at once, everyone starts screaming. So, if you don't know what a storm on the sea sounds like, it's incredibly loud. I mean, like rock concert loud. So you have to yell, but this was everyone and something was off. I peeked over the port side of the ship, the left side, and I saw, in a flash of lightning, the rogue wave. It was a wall of water, easily 4 or 5 meters higher than my perspective. I mean, this thing spanned from horizon to horizon, or at least seemed to for a brief moment. I finally then was able to hear what these people were trying to say to me. They were yelling, "Brace!" I had maybe 2 seconds to grab something. I passed the call down, and then it hit us. The ship listed at least 30 degrees, and the water poured down the hatch. I was 50% in and out of the ship. The force was so staggering, I held fast with arms and legs for all I was worth. The creepy part was how much the sound disappeared. Initially, when the wave hit us, it sounded as loud as a 10-foot fan, and then it sounded like jumping into a swim pool, and then silence. It seemed like a lifetime passed. I'm not sure, but it was really only 4 seconds. There was a brief pull, and then we were back in the heart of the storm again. The sub took on some absurd amount of water that I don't remember. It was something a bit more than our largest ballast tank. Imagine turning on a faucet 4 feet in diameter. The guy below me somehow lost his shirt during all this, and then that was that. We kept hauling the eggs, and then I went to bed, still with salt in my hair, because I was supposed to be back on watch 5 hours later, and I needed my